This video is sponsored by Brilliant. Find a better and more fun way to learn online today.
I was about 6 years old when I went on my first official trip. I was going with my father and my grandpa Sinclair up to the North Pole. It was a very glamorous destination, but the best thing about it was that I was going to be spending lots of time with my dad.
Most people today are aware of Canada's current Prime Minister, Justin Trudeau. Well, current at the time of the video anyway, since Canada's upcoming election could potentially change that. However, critics and fans of Justin Trudeau alike tend to agree on one thing. His father Pierre was a much more important Prime Minister. Pierre Elliott Trudeau was Prime Minister of Canada for 15 years, and while also a divisive figure of Canadian history, he is without a doubt the leader who brought the most changes to Canada and made it largely what it is today. Historians have always put him at least in the top 5 in spite of his divisive legacy when it comes to ranking prime ministers, and I think that shows the sheer magnitude of his actions. So who exactly was Pierre Elliott Trudeau, and what exactly did he accomplish? Well, Pierre was born in the year 1919 in the city of Montreal in Quebec, to a French-Canadian father and a Scottish-French-Canadian mother. He was raised in a very French, Quebecois, and Catholic environment, having gone to a Jesuit school and even having been a supporter of Quebec nationalism at a young age. This is a bit ironic considering what happens during his future administration as Prime Minister. As World War II broke out during his teenage years, he took stances against the possibility of forced conscription, and other than a brief 2-year stint in the Canadian Officers Training Corps, he focused more on his studies. He eventually focused his studies on various things related to political science, and during this time he was also in Harvard University. During his years there, he was exposed to a non-French and non-Catholic majority environment, which broadened his views. He became influenced by popular left-of-center ideas such as Keynesian economics, but also rejected his beliefs in Quebec nationalism and wanted to pursue politics that he believed would bring, quote, the good life for average Canadians. Trudeau also, despite being from a well-off family, decided to take travels around the world with a more humble approach, wanting to further broaden his understanding of the world and his views. By the time he came back, he realized how appalling the current system in Quebec was for him, further inspiring his desire to get into politics. Trudeau wasn't the only Quebecois to feel discomfort at the state of Quebec at the time. Quebec during the 1950s was under a more authoritarian-style conservative and religious government. It was anti-worker, anti-environmentalism, and even anti-casual clothing. Yes, really. Canada did not have a federal rule for secularism, and so Quebec as a province was able to be this strict and could only be changed at the provincial level. This period was so bad that it is now referred to as the Great Darkness. While Pierre Trudeau had always been influenced by his Roman Catholic beliefs, he thought that a secular Quebec would be more beneficial to the people of Quebec. Trudeau and other Quebecois in the 1960s contributed to what is referred to as the Quiet Revolution, in which both the Quebecois Liberal Party and the center-of-left factions of Quebec nationalist groups supported secularism, unions that protected Quebecois workers, and better representation for the French-speaking population, which during this time had actually been the worst-off group, with the majority actually living below the poverty line. Pierre Trudeau during that time heavily supported unions and became inspired by many aspects of the CCF party, who are the predecessors of the modern-day NDP. Trudeau also wanted to increase democratic principles in Canada through individual rights. However, he also thought that he would be more effective at bringing such change if he joined a party that was capable of winning at the federal level. Trudeau therefore joined the federal wing of the Liberal Party in 1965. With the 1965 election, Pierre Trudeau got elected to Parliament and under the administration of Prime Minister Lester Pearson became Minister of Justice and the Attorney General of Canada. During Pierre's time here, he notably was responsible for the Criminal Law Amendment Act of 1968-69, which among many things decriminalized contraceptives, light forms of gambling, abortion if the mother's life was in danger at the assessment of 3 doctors, and homosexuality. Trudeau famously gave a simple reasoning for the decriminalization of homosexuality.
On homosexuality, I think the view we take here is that there's no place for the state in the bedrooms of the nation, and I think that, what's done in private between adults doesn't concern the criminal code.
Trudeau's connection with 60s counterculture and his, at the time, fresh philosophy of distinguishing perceived sin from crime under the law made Pierre a very popular figure with the Canadian youth. 1968 would be further important for Trudeau's career as the Liberal Party held a competition for the new party leader after Pearson decided to retire. During the campaign, Trudeau exposed himself to more Canadians at large and was seen as a relatively young and charming face compared to the other political figures, which helped him win the leadership. There was even such a fervor over Pierre Trudeau that there was a dubbed phenomenon called Trudeaumania. After winning the leadership, Trudeau was now Canada's 15th Prime Minister. However, there would be a federal election set in June the same year. During this election, Trudeau participated in the first televised debate in Canadian history, and while the man was already perceived as charming, forward-thinking, the debate gave him another quality of appearing intellectual as well. Could Trudeaumania be even greater? Yes, because now we're going to add Strawn to the list too. During the campaign in 1968, Pierre was in Quebec where the Quiet Revolution was beginning to splinter, as the Quebec nationalist faction began to transcend into supporting overall separatism of Quebec from the rest of Canada. This led to strong protests and occasional riots in the name of these ideas, and while Pierre Trudeau was sitting outdoors at an event, pro-separatists began hurling bottles at him and other officials. On camera, Pierre, after dodging the attacks, in an act of defiance, refused to evacuate the area and went back to sitting down defiantly. Between that and his reputation for not buckling into political pressure in Parliament, this gave him a tough image that rounded out Pierre Trudeau's overall appeal. Trudeau, during the campaign, supported the ideas of making a just society for Canada, in which through participatory democracy, Canada would be made better for average Canadians. This included defending the recently implemented Canadian Universal Healthcare System that was implemented under the 1966 Medical Care Act, as well as leaning towards a federalist philosophy over Canada. Canada was a confederation in which the individual provinces, as previously mentioned, had a lot more individual control over their affairs. But it also meant that there was no federal-wide standard for rights or certain governmental systems. Once the election had completed, Pierre Trudeau won a majority government in Canada, increasing his administration's strength. During his first term, or as referred to in Canada, his first government, he modernized parliamentary procedure to make it more efficient, increased welfare programs, and officially established bilingualism in Canada by making both English and French the two official languages of Canada. This was an effort to improve the inclusion of Canada's francophone population. However, this ironically angered Quebec nationalists as they wanted Quebec to be more separate from Canada, not more integrated. The tension with Quebec would lead to a bigger crisis. In 1970, a Marxist group of Quebecois separatists called the FLQ kidnapped British Trade Consul James Cross from his residence, and soon after also kidnapped the Quebec Labour Minister Pierre Laporte. There was a crisis in how to react to the situation, as there were few precedents on how a federal government could intervene in a situation like this, and to what extent. Trudeau vowed to arrest the terrorists and rescue the men at whatever cost. Famously, Trudeau was asked in an interview at how far he would go.
It's more important to keep law and order in this society than to be worried about weak-kneed people who don't like the looks of a soldier.
At any cost? At any cost? How far would you go with that? How far would you extend that?
Well, just watch me.
Trudeau would end up being quite serious in his words, and controversially enabled the War Measures Act in order to capture the terrorists and arrest them immediately. This was seen as a very controversial move by more parliamentarian-minded members of government, especially since the act had not been used since World War II. But the Canadian public opinion overall supported the strong stance. When justifying the use of federal force to rescue the men, Trudeau notably said the following.
Canadians have always assumed that it could not happen here, and as a result we are doubly shocked that it has. Our assumption may have been naive, but it was understandable. Understandable because democracy flourishes in Canada. Understandable because individual liberty is cherished in Canada. Notwithstanding these conditions, partly because of them, it has now been demonstrated to us by a few misguided persons just how fragile a democratic society can be if democracy is not prepared to defend itself, and just how vulnerable to blackmail are tolerant, compassionate people.
Unfortunately, Laporte was found dead. Nearly 500 people were arrested after federal troops were sent to Quebec to restore order, although the great majority would be soon released. However, the kidnappers of James Cross themselves ended up agreeing to release Cross in exchange for exile to Cuba. In early 1971, the state of emergency ended and troops were withdrawn, Trudeau appearing to be somewhat of a hero, even if using controversial means. For foreign policy, Trudeau was committed to supporting NATO, but he wasn't afraid to meet with world leaders independently on his own terms. Notably, Canada warmed relations with both China and Cuba well before the Americans did. Trudeau also married his first wife, Margaret Sinclair, in 1971, rounding out a very eventful first government for the Prime Minister. But 1972 would bring a new election in which Pierre won, but was reduced to a minority government, with the NDP being the balance of power. This kind of forced a cooperation to pass legislation, and so the Liberals and NDP would end up working together to pass a bill that would set in motion the creation of Petro-Canada, a state-ran corporation that was in response to heavily increasing oil prices around the world. This followed a trend of focusing on pro-Canadian economic policies, as Canada wished to protect its local industries and businesses from foreign competition. This is a little bit understandable once you realize that their only bordering neighbor was literally the largest economy in the world, the United States. While Petro-Canada was somewhat unpopular in most of Alberta, the rest of Canada largely supported it and saw it as somewhat of a symbol of Canadian patriotism and unity. The second government of Trudeau would not last long, however, as the views of increased antagonism by the administration along with the 1973 worldwide recession would lead to Parliament to declare a vote of no confidence. This meant 1974 would already be an election year. While we're in between terms here, I'd like to interject for a bit to talk about this video's sponsor, Brilliant. There are many ways people learn and many ways that you can help yourself do a much better job at it. Sometimes it simply takes a more hands-on experience or a testing of what you've learned with puzzles or problems. Well, Brilliant is just the thing for that. Brilliant is a website and app with a hands-on approach to learning about subjects such as computers, math, science, and tons of others. Their visualizations, problems, and interactive experiences help you better learn the subject you set your mind to. You might think that puzzles are already helpful enough on their own, yet Brilliant recently increased the interactivity on their platform even more. That means there's even more ways to manipulate objects on screen to help with your learning. When it comes to subjects I'm not the best at, I can appreciate knowing I have a website like Brilliant to help me brush up on things, especially ones I'm not familiar with in those subjects when I need to learn them quickly. I encourage you to sign up for Brilliant today using the link brilliant.org/EmperorTigerStar, which is also posted in the description. The first 200 people to use the link will get 20% off their membership, so sign up quickly. Thanks again to Brilliant for sponsoring this video. Trudeau ended up winning a majority in the 1974 election, and therefore a third government. Trudeau's third government would, however, be Pierre's most stressful term in office. Quebec began butting heads with the federal government yet again. There was a strain in his marriage that the media kept covering relentlessly, and a few situations of bumping heads with foreign leaders, such as over allowing Beijing over Taipei in the Montreal Olympics of 1976, didn't exactly help things. Trudeau was able to show a level of reservedness outwardly to the press, which significantly helped him in his polling. But off-screen, he was apparently more prone to outbursts and perceived rants of arrogance with opposition leaders, perhaps due to the pressure getting to him, but either way, it began to increase his unpopularity within Parliament. Aside from the more dramatic side, there were more comprehensive environmental laws introduced, as well as the abolishment of the death penalty. But in 1979, it was election time yet again. This time, the Progressive Conservative Party's leader, Joe Clark, was increasing in the polls. The 1979 election occurred, and while the Liberal Party won the most votes, their support was concentrated in Ontario and Quebec, and so by going through the most number of seats, Joe Clark won and became Prime Minister. As per tradition in Canada and many other parliamentary nations, upon losing, Pierre Trudeau resigned as party leader. While it seemed like Pierre's career was over after 11 years in office, this would actually end up not being the case. With Trudeau resigned and Joe Clark being the new Prime Minister of Canada, Pierre's career, despite being monumental in its change for Canada, was not yet over. Joe Clark, despite his victory, was not seen as good as or as experienced as his contemporaries. Being 39, he was the youngest Prime Minister Canada ever had, but when it came to proposing the new budget, he was unable to get it passed. According to Canadian law, his failure to pass the budget was an equivalent of a vote of no confidence, therefore giving Joe Clark's 9-month government the shortest government in Canadian history at the time. While Pierre Trudeau favored being succeeded by Donald MacDonald, he was begged to return as the party's leader for the new election. Trudeau was a bit reluctant to return as he was hoping to enjoy a nice retirement, but ended up agreeing. Joe Clark's failure to simply pass a budget, something that was viewed as a very basic function of government, gave the sense that the Progressive Conservative Party couldn't run a government. Using this momentum, the election of 1980 resulted in a Liberal majority for Trudeau, once again bringing him back into the office of Prime Minister. Trudeau's fourth government would prove to be a very eventful one, as virtually right away Pierre had to deal with troubles from, once again, Quebec. This time, Quebec decided to host a referendum for independence in 1980. While Pierre did not want to give legitimacy to the referendum, he decided not to stop it and instead did his best to campaign to support rejecting independence for Quebec. He notably sent future Prime Minister Jean Chrétien to help with this. He also gave a famous speech in which he appealed to the idea of what it meant to be Canadian and appealed to the ideas of federalism. In a 59 to 41% split, independence was rejected. Pierre Trudeau said that it was his proudest moment as both a Quebecois and a Canadian. While it appeared Quebec was not going to leave Canada after all, Pierre was determined to federalize Canada once and for all. In 1982, Pierre Trudeau was finally able to patriate the Constitution of Canada. This meant that Canada was now able to amend its own constitution on its own terms without the approval of the British Parliament, which had been required since the Statute of Westminster in 1931. Effectively, this meant Canada was now 100% independent of the British government in a way it technically wasn't in 1867 or 1931. With this accomplishment, Pierre Trudeau could now finally focus on his original ultimate desire of a federal constitutional set of rights for all Canadians. After consulting leaders of every province, the government passed the Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedoms. The Constitutional Act of 1982 also set in motion the acknowledgement of Indigenous rights for First Nation peoples in Canada, set desires to promote equal opportunity for all Canadians, expanded the scope of judicial review in Canada, and overall finally set in place a federalized Canada. There were still criticisms from some Indigenous groups and Quebecois about federalization and what it meant to ideas of minority autonomy in local governments, but its passage overall changed Canada's government forever. The other major event of Trudeau's fourth government was the attempt of nationalizing Canada's energy policy. This was another attempt at economic nationalism by protecting Canadian economical interests, but this was viewed harshly by the western provinces that produced the most energy for Canada. The price controls implemented over energy were controversial, and its effect on avoiding an even worse oil crisis such as that in the United States were constantly debated. This, along with the previously implemented Petro-Canada, helped begin a tension between Canada's western provinces and the rest of the country. Pierre Trudeau's attempt to fix this was by including party members from the western provinces more in his cabinet and policy making, but this didn't fix relations. In 1984, Pierre Trudeau finally decided it was once again time to retire, and this time permanently. John Turner succeeded him as leader of the Liberal Party, but his time as Prime Minister would be even shorter than Joe Clark's, and the Progressive Conservative Party under Brian Mulroney won a majority government in the 1984 election in a landslide comparable to Ronald Reagan's in the United States. No political movements last forever. While some aspects of Trudeau's accomplishments, such as nationalized energy, would be undone by the Mulroney administration, along with the reduction of certain welfare programs as was common across many Anglosphere nations during the 1980s, Trudeau's legacy was largely there to stay. Those focusing on the positives talk about him giving Canada a constitution with a charter of rights, decriminalizing homosexuality, and not being afraid to give Canada more to say on the global stage in its own interests. For more negative outcomes, one could point to the current tensions between the prairie provinces and the East and link it back to his attempts at nationalizing energy. In the case of Quebec, bilingualism and federalism may not have ended tensions entirely, but they've certainly reduced them and shaped how tensions continue to this very day, and at the very least have twice prevented Quebec from leaving Canada altogether. Pierre Elliott Trudeau would die in the year 2000 at the age of 80, and his funeral was attended by many people, including Jimmy Carter, Fidel Castro, the Aga Khan, and singer-songwriter Leonard Cohen. This variety of guests certainly demonstrated the variety of his impact. Pierre Trudeau was of mixed legacy in opinion, yet of monumental legacy with his actions, and undoubtedly the man that made modern Canada what it is today. Thanks for watching.
An emotional day like this, a difficult one for an objective historian.
I've never been objective. I leave that to the saints. I have been moved for the past 4 days to a very large degree because it seems to me that there is a continuity. Pierre Trudeau continued the dream and the vision of Sir Wilfrid Laurier. And Sir Wilfrid Laurier articulated it in 19th century words, and he carried it on into the 20th and the 21st century. And now what Canadians have got to realize is what he has taught us, and what Laurier taught us, that this country is worth having. And if we don't have it, and if we don't keep it, and if we don't cherish it, it will not be here.